I'm Mike Berger, the editor of LBM Journal, and I want to thank you for joining our webinar today entitled Executing Your Succession Plan. What should you expect and who should be on your team? Presented by Sam Brownell from Stratus Wealth Advisors. So you have received an independent valuation, completed a post-ownership cash flow analysis, and determined your top transition options. Well, now what? It's helpful to benchmark your business and plan for future scenarios. However, this often leaves a business owner with a lot of information that requires time and expertise to implement. Well, today, Sam is going to discuss how Stratus works with you to assemble the right team of professionals to help execute your succession plan. Since most business owners will only go through this process once, it is important to know what to expect, who to hire for coordination and implementation, what additional professionals are needed, and potential costs to the business. Our goal today is to show you that a well-developed and implemented succession plan is an investment in your business that will leave you more profitable and more marketable, a win for you, your family, your employees, and your customers. So a couple of details before we get started. All attendees are muted, so you can hear us, but we can't hear you. So if you're having any technical issues, click the chat button at the bottom of the screen to send us a message, and we'll work to quickly address any problems. Now, if you have questions for Sam, click the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen anytime and type in your question, and Sam will address as many as possible as they come up. And lastly, we expect the webinar to be finished in about 30 to 40 minutes. We are recording it, and we'll send a link to the recording to everyone who registered. Plus, we'll post it on lbmjournal.com. So with all of that, I turn the webinar over to Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. And as Mike said, please, as questions come up, let us know, and we'll try to get those things answered as we go through here. So it's we're really excited to be here. This is a little bit different. We're going to talk today more about the implementation process. We've done a lot of discussion in the past about how to figure out what the business is worth, what type of legal documents might you need in place, what are some of the transition options. All of these are really good, but what we find is that a lot of owners will end up in a place where they have a bunch of to-dos and no idea how to do them, or not the time to do them, or maybe not the expertise. And so it's really important, because this is a very specific type of work, this transition type work, that we get it right and that we do it in a way that helps the owner, as opposed to just dropping a bunch of paper on their desk and saying, here are more things to do along with all the other things you have to do as an owner of a business. So that's really what we're going to dive into today. So just a brief background on myself and Stratus. We are a company that provides this type of work, succession planning, business valuation, to independent dealers across the country. We can work anywhere. We do a lot of work with the personal side too. And it's important to note that we have that service there in case people need it, but it's not necessary. And we work with a lot of financial advisors. We work with a lot of CPAs across the country to provide very specific expertise in the transition and how that links up with your personal advice. But you don't have to. If you've got somebody out there that you're already working with for, money management, personal financial planning, all that, we're happy to coordinate and work alongside them. Right? You don't have to uproot the entire thing. We're here for whatever service you need, and we can come in and do this very specific transition work. So just to get started, one of the things that can be very, very challenging about transition work is that it is unknown. And because it's something that you're only going to do once, it can lead to this kind of procrastination, as you can see here, right? If you're familiar with Calvin and Hobbes, one of Calvin's great traits is procrastination, and he loves to tell Hobbes about it, but it really can be true. And here, procrastination isn't coming from I, as the business owner or owners, don't want to do the right thing. It's where do I even start? And then once I get an initial idea of where I started, how do I make this work? Because it can be very difficult when you end up with, let's say, a succession plan that says you need to do A, B, C, D, and E. Well, how do I do A, B, C, D, and E? Who do I turn to if I don't know? Do I really want to be the one who's driving this bus? And do I have people in place with the expertise to do it? And so what we find is all of those questions lead to procrastination, because where do we start? Well, I don't even know. I don't have time to worry about it. So I'm going to put this aside and I'll come back to it at a later date when I have more time. Well, as all of us know, as a business owner, that time usually never comes. And so this just gets pushed off and pushed off. And one of the things that we really want to talk about today is making sure that we're doing this planning and having this implementation put in place before something happens, before a health event happens, before there's a deterioration of partnerships, before the new generation comes in and maybe they aren't ready yet because we haven't planned for it. We just thought, geez, I'm really tired. I need to get out of this business. So really, really important to get ahead of the curve here. So the steps, these are the steps we're going to talk about today, these 5 steps. And as we go through, following each one, following a discussion on each one, we're then going to turn around and we're going to look at a case study with examples drawn from clients that we have worked with or are currently potentially working with. And what are some of the issues that are important for you to remember as you think about your own succession planning process? Because we can learn a lot from other people's mistakes, and we can make sure that when we're going through this process, however we decide to do it, that we're not going to run into some of these same pitfalls. So let's start with step 1 here, which is build the foundation. And this is something that's important for everybody to do. This is what at Stratus we call your initial succession planning engagement. You have to get an independent valuation. You have to know what your business is worth. And what we do in these valuations is it's more than just, okay, here's your bottom line number. We're going to slap some multiple on it. What we're doing is we're diving in and we're looking at your business as a potential buyer would. We are looking through your receivables. We are trying to see, are you collecting all of them? What does your inventory look like? How are you turning it over compared to the industry? What fixed assets do you have? What type of investment do you need to make in the future? Do you have a bunch of trucks or forklifts that are sitting around that are 20 or 30 years old? Okay. If I'm a buyer, and I know that I have to put money investment into new fixed assets, that's money I'm not going to pay to you as the owner. And so then what we want to look at is, okay, now that we know what this business is worth, how does that fit into your planning? And we do that through what we call post-ownership cash flow analysis. How do we take, let's say the business is worth $7.5 million. Well, is that plus your other assets enough to support your lifestyle for the next 20 or 30 years? Maybe, maybe not. And that's going to impact this third bullet here, which is, what are the transition options? Do we need to get top dollar out of this or not? Because that can change the way this is structured. It can change the tax implications. It can change the fees that you might have to pay. So all of this stuff becomes really, really important for you to look through as you are building your succession plan. So let's go on here. We've got our first case study here, which is about foundation. Okay, build the foundation. So there's a lot of M&A activity. Been a lot of M&A activity in this field in the last 5 years or so. If we're just paying attention to that M&A activity, if we're just looking at what's reported in the news, that can lead to some problems. And the big problem is that typically when you see an M&A reported, typically this is a private deal. It doesn't have to be publicly reported. There will be very little information. If there's any information at all, it might be about what the overall price was, but that tells you nothing about the underlying business. And so taking your business and comparing it to something that you've read in the paper or a competitor that you know of means not a whole lot, because how comparable are your businesses? What is your product mix versus theirs? How does that impact gross margin? How many customers do you have versus your competitor or somebody you read about in the news? How concentrated is that customer base? And are you dealing with pros? Are you dealing with retail clients? What's the mix there? So all of these things can have a big impact on the ultimate sale price, and your business may not line up with these. So if you see somebody out there getting 5.5, 6 times, maybe you can get that too. Maybe you can't. But this is where it gets back to doing the good planning, right? Making sure that you are getting objective advice. And we'll talk about that later because it becomes important through the succession planning process. But it really is important to get that objective advice, because otherwise what happens is a lot of times we're setting ourselves up for disappointment. We're anchoring on something that isn't actually the reality for our situation. So really important to think about that. Right? Transition team. Really important to build a transition team. And folks like us at Stratus, there are other succession planning firms out there. We're here to help because this is a transition team that's a little bit different. You may have an excellent group of current advisors, CPA, corporate attorney, banker, all these folks, but do they have that specialized expertise that is going to help make this a win? And this is a win for everybody. As Mike said in the introduction, it's going to be a win for you as the outgoing owner. It's got to be a win for the folks who are coming in. You can't leave them saddled with debt or in a position where they need to make a whole bunch of investments, but they're paying you off for maybe a price that wasn't ultimately deserved. Then you have to wonder, are you going to be able to do this objectively? Right? Are you going to be able to do this objectively without these advisors? And so getting the right people in the right place. And this is where I think a case study can be really important, because we see this happen all the time. Any good business is going to have good advisors, right? But their job is to help the business operationally and maybe strategically, but not necessarily in the transition. And so I'll give you an example here. A lot of times we'll sit down and we'll have a CPA tell us that, oh, you can't do that. You can't grant shares directly to an employee. You can only grant new shares from Treasury. Well, that's not true. And it doesn't mean that this is a bad CPA. It just means that this CPA doesn't have experience in this specific area of transitions. And so it may be that you have to bring in a special tax or corporate attorney that works in private business transitions. And that's where we would go in and we would help you, and we would look at what do you need and who might be a good fit. Because we've got to get the right people in the right places. And I think part of this too is thinking about, do you view this as an investment in the growth and value of your business, or is this a cost center? And in this industry, yes, we're a low margin industry. Cost can be very, very important. But if we're going to do this transition and we're going to do it right, and we're going to make sure we're trying to maximize value and marketability, having the right people in the right places makes a really big difference, because an investment of $30,000, $40,000 could mean the difference in a couple $100,000 of selling price. That makes a big difference.
So, Sam, if I can jump in here for a second,
Please.
we do have a question for you. What is a typical succession plan implementation timeline? I'd like to know what time commitment this will involve for me.
Yeah, so that's great, and good question, Mike. And we're actually going to get to that a little bit, a couple slides later. We'll talk specifically timeline, but in general, I'd say 3 to 5 years, right? If you're ideally thinking that I might exit in 2028, let's say, then now is a good time to start. And so we'll talk about the actual transition as we get a little bit farther on, but great question. So here's where we get into your involvement. Right? How much do you as the owner or owners want to be involved in this? And a lot of this comes down to objectivity. And can you hold yourself accountable? And a lot of this goes back, if there were folks who were with us last year in Charlotte at the LBM Strategies Conference, there was a session by Jim Sobek, and one of the things he talked about was that bottom point. Do you really want to negotiate on your behalf? And then that again gets back to how well can you as the owner drive the ship, make a bunch of critical decisions, both in terms of the transition, but also in terms of your business. And are you going to be able to hold yourself accountable? What happens if you miss a milestone? And is that something that you're gonna say, geez, we really have to get back on this, or are you gonna need somebody to push you? And so this is where having the right people in the right places can make a very, very big difference in the actual implementation, because these are people who are going to help you along the way say, all right, we need to get another valuation of the business. Is this business actually, or what you're doing, is it making the business more valuable? Is it making it more marketable? These are all things that are ultimately going to matter, but if we're not checking in along the way, we could be spending a whole lot of time and wandering down a path that's not very helpful to us. And so typically when we look at these and we want to help the owner, we're going to look at some different areas, right? What does your customer concentration look like? Where do your margins compare to the industry? Things like that. Do you have anything internal to the business that's big that might need to be written off? And let's not wait to spring that on a potential buyer. Let's maybe accelerate a write-off so we can get that off our books right now. Okay, being transparent becomes really, really important in this process. So when we talk, typically when we think about determining an owner involvement, again, this is where owners want to be cost conscious, and we certainly understand that, right? You don't want to spend money frivolously. But a lot of times what happens is you end up bringing in family members or other trusted contacts to fill in the roles of folks who should have been hired externally, right? Who should have been external objective advisors. And so to this second point, we see a lot of times where an owner will have a brother or a sister who's an attorney. There's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing wrong with having them look at legal documents and things like that. But there are as many different types of attorneys as you can imagine. And if you bring in your brother or sister, the attorney, who's very focused in a specific area, let's say environmental law, they're probably not going to be a whole lot of use when it comes to what are the tax implications of granting stock. It's just not their area of expertise. It doesn't mean that they're not a great attorney, but this is where we need to get the right people in the right places, because now the advice that you're paying for will be very tailored to exactly what we have planned in the initial phase, right? Step one, for you to do. And if we're bringing in somebody who is just going to muddy the waters and bring up a lot of different questions, then we're just kind of running in circles. And we find that that can be frustrating for everybody involved, but particularly the owner, because you end up chasing your tail around after something to convince your family member that you were on the right track before, and it could be 2 weeks later. And now you've paid a whole bunch of people for those 2 weeks, and you're back right where you were at the beginning. All right. And 2 weeks is generous, right? Generally, we're talking months here that we can delay because of the fact that we didn't get the right people in the right places. And we're not saying don't have outside advisors, trusted people to work with. What we're saying is that when it comes to actually putting together and implementing the plan, let's make sure that the people we're using have expertise in this area so that we're seeing value for what we're paying for and not chasing our tails. So step 4, risk mitigation, right? This becomes a really, really big one. This is where, in our opinion, all of those legal documents that were drafted years and years ago need to be dusted off, reviewed, amended. Because legal documents don't seem terribly important until something happens, and then they're critical, right? They are going to determine things like, how does ownership pass? What is the payment for a share if somebody happens to be disabled or die? Okay, and so thinking through how do you want this transition to happen? Are you selling 100%? Are you not? Right? Owners might have a shareholder loan in the business. How is that going to be protected? How is the family going to be protected? If the owner dies, how does that loan get paid out? Is there insurance to cover that loan? Do you have key employees? Do they have estate plans? What happens if one of them can't work? Do you have an insurance policy? Do you have a key person policy in place that could provide cash flow to replace that person, or at least to replace them part-time? Okay. Bylaws, operating agreements, shareholder agreements, all of these are important, particularly if you are somebody that is going to transition over time, or there are already multiple owners in the business. It's like it's your prenup. And it's a lot easier to get into this stuff than it is to get out of it. Okay. And the other thing that we would really encourage folks to look at is most owners do not have employment agreements. They're the owner of the business. But there are things you can cover in an employment agreement that you can't necessarily cover in a shareholder agreement or an operating agreement. And what are responsibilities? Who takes those responsibilities over? If we have an owner that gets disabled and isn't performing their job responsibilities, well, maybe we can terminate them as an employee, but maybe we don't want to do that as a shareholder so that their family can continue to get payouts to help with whatever has happened. Right? So it gives you more flexibility. It also gives you more protection. And so a quick look here. And this could happen inside a family, outside a family. In this case, we're talking about it's two non-family business partners, great friends. They've worked together for a long time, haven't put a whole lot of stuff in place, right? They don't have a shareholder agreement. There's not a lot of insurance. There's no employment agreements. One of them suffers a traumatic brain injury. There's nothing you can do about this stuff, but now you're running into some issues. How do you handle what to do with this person? How do you work with their family? Because that can become really important too. Maybe the family's sitting there saying, geez, this is great. We're going to be able to collect money and we don't have to do anything. We'll just hold on to these shares. Business is kicking off $2 or $3 million bottom line. That looks great for us, but is that really great for the business? Do you want people as owners who aren't involved in the operations of the strategy? Could those distributions be better put to use, reinvested in the company? Hiring a new partner or a new manager? So again, as we go through this implementation stage, we need to really make sure that we're thinking through the risk mitigation, trying to make sure that we don't run into any issues that could blow up the plan or significantly derail it because we weren't expecting something to happen. Right, and this gets back, so Mike had asked a good question earlier about timeline. And so this is really what it's about, and this gets back to those questions of how do you hold yourself accountable? And are you the right person to objectively run the process? And so the timeline is going to go over, all right, we went through an initial succession planning phase. How are we going to increase marketability? How are we going to make this business more attractive to buyers? Do we have an owner that is so involved in the business that it's going to be very hard to extract them without losing a lot of these relationships? If that's an issue, then we need to put together a plan and part of this timeline and start implementing that plan, right? We like to think of it as a stoplight, right? Sit down, list out everything that you do on a day-to-day basis as an owner, and then color code it. Green are those things you could pass over very easily. Hey, I don't need to be involved in the annual insurance reviews. Right? Yellow are things that might be a little bit more tricky. Hiring and firing, let's say. And then red are things that are going to be much more difficult. I'm the one that does all the purchasing. I'm the one who's in charge of any loans with the bank. I have the relationships with our biggest 20 customers. right? And then we start building out a plan. How are we going to transition these? Who are we transitioning them to? Do we need to hire somebody to take on some of these roles? So again, just thinking through and asking yourself some questions, right? Is this a business that I can go walk away for 6 weeks and I'll come back and it's more or less running as I would expect? And how am I going to hold myself accountable? This idea about communication with your employees. What does the exit look like? When should it be communicated to the employees? How do you keep them motivated? And then this last part about contingency planning, all right, also becomes important in this implementation phase. What if we are convinced that we've got a great buyer across town, but then they run into some issue? They get into a shareholder dispute. They have an issue with a vendor. Now they're not so sure anymore and they're going to back out. Well, where do we go now? We had been assuming that this was our plan. Maybe it's not going to be our plan now. And so this is something where we work through the whole case. Initial value of the business, a lot of times it can be disappointing. And it's not what you thought. Your business is not like other people. The market has changed. The option that you're looking at may not get you the top dollar that you thought. All right, all fine. We can work on all these things. But we need to establish that timeline, and then we need to stick with it and make adjustments as needed. But we need to set something up so that from beginning to end, we know where we're going, when different advisors are going to be useful in this process. When do we bring in the attorney? When do we bring in the CPA? Coordination, communication becomes a huge part of this. And really, really, it just makes the process easier. It sounds like a lot of work, but that's why you hire folks to help you with this so that you don't have to do all of it by yourself. All right, just a couple closing notes here about value, right? Remember what gives your business value. At the end of the day, what gives your business value is also what's going to make it more marketable. And what are your sustainable earnings? Right? And sustainable means different things, but really think about what products you have that sell like commodities and which ones that don't. Right? Commodity products, if lumber prices quadruple like they did, we can't really rely on that revenue coming in the future. No buyer, especially nowadays, is going to sit there and say, yeah, I'm going to pay you more because the supply and demand for commodities was out of whack, right? Not going to happen. Look at that EBITDA, right? Big number that's thrown around: earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Look at it in dollar terms. Also look at it in margin, meaning take that EBITDA number, divide it by your revenue. What is that percent? And is it north of 10? That's a good place to be. Commodity versus value add products, like we talked about before. Windows, doors, millwork, things like that. Think about that. How involved is the owner to the business? Do you have a niche? Maybe you're a lumberyard near a city that has a huge historic district. And maybe that's part of your niche. You're providing specific millwork for historic homes. Right? That could be a great one. But how do you define that? How do you talk about that to somebody? All right. And this final one is willing to take some risk in the sale. And that comes down to, are you potentially willing to say, yeah, I don't want all cash up front, because that really is not going to happen very often anymore, but it can also lead to higher prices. So, yeah, Mike.
So a question has come in. Does the succession planning process differ if I am selling internally or externally?
Yeah. Great question. And so let's talk about that a little bit on this next slide here about net value. Okay, so internally, right, if I'm selling to key employees, my family, maybe to my employees through an employee stock ownership plan or a cooperative or something along those lines, right? That's typically what's called a stock sale, where most of the gain will be taxed at long-term capital gains rates. And typically those are lower. If I'm selling to a third party, right, a competitor, a private equity group, something like that, a roll-up, any of these things, there's going to be a mix, right? There's going to be a mix of taxed at ordinary income versus taxed at long-term gains. And it doesn't align with the buyers and the sellers. Typically, what benefits the buyer means the seller pays ordinary income. What benefits the seller is what is long-term capital gains, and that's part of the negotiation process. And so what we typically look at is, regardless, we're going to want to start planning. Once you enter a sale, or you get an indication of interest, letter of intent from a private equity group or a strategic competitor, you're probably looking six months, right? And in general, there's going to be a buyout of most, if not all, at the end of that 6 months. But if we're not preparing for that 6 months, for 18 to 36 months beforehand, the deal may not happen in the first place, and it may not be at a price that you want. Internal transitions typically take a little bit longer because we may not be turning over 100% of the interest at one time. We may be doing 20% a year for 5 years. We may be doing 30, and 40, right? And part of that is with the internal transfer, you as the owner have a little bit more control over when that ownership and when that control over decisions moves from you to whoever the buyer is. For an external buyer, typically the timeline is, let's get the business as marketable, as profitable as we can, and then we have a best chance to get it sold, and that selling process takes 6 months. For an internal, it's going to be a lot more work because it's going to take more years, right? We typically don't have somebody with deep pockets to come in and just buy out 100% right off the top. But that doesn't mean that can't be a great option.
I got a suspicion that this question might be answered a little later on, but when do I communicate a transition to my employees? Should I discuss with a subset of them first?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Mike, and I think an important one for everybody to think through. Part of it has to deal with how big the business is, right? If you're a business that's, got 10 or 12 employees, it's probably a little bit easier to communicate to everybody, and they can talk and you can have a meeting. If you've got a couple hundred employees, it's going to be a little bit difficult. But typically the way these go, again, it divides a little bit along internal and external. With an external buyer, a lot of this is done confidentially. A lot of the negotiations are done, with the owner, the buyer. Maybe there's a key employee or so involved, but it's typically going to be the owner, the advisors, and the buyer, right? If we're internal, you have a little bit more flexibility as to who is involved in these discussions. And what we like to do is, typically first we want to involve the family. Right? We want to get the family involved, or the families, depending on how many owners there are, and make sure that they can talk through it and discuss what's going on. That's really important, right? Especially if we have younger generations that are or might be interested in the business. So we've got to communicate family. Key employees are typically next, right? Making sure that your managers, your general managers, understand, why are we doing this? What's the end result? What will be my role as the outgoing owner in the business going forward? And am I just going to cut and run, or am I going to try to be here over some period of transition time to help? Right. And so that becomes important. And then you're going to want to ultimately open it up and let everybody know. But what you really want to do is make sure that you're communicating with your key folks, because they're the ones that, if you sell the business and they go, well, geez, I don't like the way that went down, or I didn't really have a whole lot of input, or I didn't feel like I was heard, and they walk out the door, that can be real trouble, right? And that can tank a good transition because the communication was poor. So really think about that from the inside out, right? The family and key employees, then you open it up to a wider swath of folks, and just be open as the owner or owners to listening to questions and concerns, frustrations. I think it's really important during this process, because it's a lot, right? It's a lot emotionally for you, but it's also a lot emotionally for your employees, and your customers as well. I think that's kind of that last step, right? Is making sure that your good relationships know, your top relationships, and then moving on from there. But really, that's the inside out approach that we would take to doing this. So just to finish off here, getting back to value, net value is what matters, right? Make sure you have the right experts in the right place that can really think through what are you going to get out of this business after taxes are paid, after fees are paid, all of this, because that's what ultimately you're going to be able to use as cash to live off of, right? So if your business is worth $10 million, you're going to end up paying 35–40% of it away in taxes. Well, we're not planning on 10 million. We're planning on more like 6 or 6.5 million. That's a big difference. So let's make sure we know the difference. Okay. So again, we're here to help. Please reach out. We're happy to discuss. Every single one of these situations is going to be different, is going to be unique. So please call us up. We don't want you to get caught with a number in your head, and it turns out that that number is not applicable to your business. And so let's really think through this before you get started. And we're always happy to talk. Right? Give us a call, shoot us an email, ask a question. You know, we're happy to get you started thinking through this process before you actually start thinking, well, who do I need to engage to get my plan in place and to actually implement that plan? Let's get the knowledge out there first. So with that, I'm done on my end, Mike. So any other questions we can answer?
Yeah, feel free, folks, to type in. Oh, and here we go. Here's a question. How do I determine the appropriate amount of life insurance for the owners of my business?
Yeah, good question. And so what we would suggest is that in a lot of instances, when you have multiple owners, life insurance can be a great way to buy out that owner without unduly impacting the cash flow of the business. And so typically a good way to do it is in your agreement, there should be a clause that says, we're going to get a valuation every 1 to 2 years of the business. And we're going to use that to update our life insurance policies, right? Well, and that can be however you want. You know, some people like to set and say, look, we're going to make it very easy to do our business valuation. We're going to say it's going to be your assets minus your liabilities. That's what our shareholder agreement says. Some people want the objectivity of a third party, right? Part of it's going to be determined by how you want to structure your buyouts. Okay. And that's something that we can help each business go through individually. But really what you want to do is you want to get an updated number for what the business is worth. Because what we see often is we'll come in and value a business. They haven't updated the insurance policies in 20 years. They've got 3 owners. Each has a $500,000 life insurance policy. The company's worth $8 million. That's not gonna, that $500,000 might be a nice down payment, but it's not gonna do a whole lot to help the company pay off an owner that died or retired or whatever the case was. So really think about how do you want that business to be valued? And we need to do it on an ongoing basis because it does 2 things. Number one, it helps with the insurance, but it also helps all the owners get on the same page so that if something does happen, somebody decides to leave the business, whether they decide it themselves or it's decided for them, you know, unfortunately through a health incident, there's not a whole lot of arguing because, oh, geez, yeah, we just got a valuation, you know, January of 2023, and it said the business was worth $7.5 million. All right, well, we know now, everybody knows, and everybody has agreed to that. We're not going to have a whole lot of fighting over the value piece of it. So I would suggest everybody take a look. If you've got multiple owners, take a look at your shareholder agreement, your buy-sell provisions, see if they have information on insurance and how that insurance is to be determined, because typically an annual valuation based off of the way that your shareholder agreement is written is a good way to do it. It doesn't cost a ton of money to update valuations year after year, and it'll give you the peace of mind that there's not going to be a whole lot of argument.
Got a question here from Austin who asks, how would you handle a situation where there might be 3 owners and a couple of them are ready to retire, but not all 3 of them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what you have to do is you have to start looking at what is the timeline of each owner, right? This gets back to the timeline question, is that when does each owner ideally want out of the business? And then let's start to back into, okay, how are we going to set up the buyout for owner number one? How are we going to set up the buyout for owner number two? And maybe there's a third owner in there who's saying, yeah, I'm in my mid-50s. I'm going to do this at least for another 15 or 20 years. So how are we setting up the timeline for each one? How is the payout going to work there? Do we have things like insurance in place? How is that going to work towards paying folks out? Right. And then what does each owner, does each owner have their personal documents? Do we have estate documents in place? What happens if something, if somebody dies, where do those shares end up? How do we as the company buy those back over what period of time? So it really comes down to sitting down with the three owners and starting to create that table of, all right, here's what it looks like for owner one, owner two, owner three, and then let's make sure that it works for the company within that, because at the end of the day, it can get tough if you have multiple owners leaving at the same time, or when they leave, it overlaps, because you could end up with years where there's quite a high payout there, and maybe there are ways to get around that, right? And so we need to think through first, what does the timeline look like? And then we can start thinking about, okay, how does it actually work in practice so that everybody's happy with what's going on?
Great. I don't see any other questions. Sam, thank you so much for this great information today. And folks, as I mentioned, you will get an email with a link to the recording of today's webinar, and we will also post that on lbmjournal.com. Unless there's any other questions that anyone has, we're just about at our stopping point. So again, Sam,
Thanks,
thank
Mike.
you so much.
And
Thanks
thanks everybody for listening.
attending. Yep.